By the spring of 1882, Nora had learned to count what was left instead of what was gone. One green shawl, still good through the shoulders, a tin cup, 9 coppers knotted in a rag, a pair of boots that let the wet in at the left toe, and a boy of 6, Toby, burning so hot against her neck that she could feel his fever come up through her own collarbone with every mile she walked. She had counted these things on a road that ran along the Sable, and the Sable was no longer the quiet green ribbon it had been in April. Snowmelt had come down out of the high country all at once, and the river had climbed its banks and gone the color of a plowed field, and it carried whole trees along sideways as though they weighed nothing at all. A drifting woman does a sum in the dark that nobody teaches her. Nora had done it twice already that week, and it came out the same both times. If the boy did not get warm and dry before another night closed over them, the road would keep him for good. The bridge at Kettle Ford was the last crossing for 11 miles, a long plank span set on stone piers, and the town lay on the far side of it. She could see the lamps coming up in the windows, warm and shut and a whole flood away. She came down the last slope with Toby's face pressed into her shawl and set her boot on the first board. And a man on the far pier stood up out of the dusk and hollered at her to get back. Get back, it was going. She got back. She had the child to think of. She had barely stepped off the planks when a cottonwood the size of a barn came down the current sideways and struck the middle pier, and the whole span folded into the brown water with a groan she felt in her teeth and went downstream into the dark. The lamps of Kettle Ford stayed exactly where they were, close enough to count and past all reaching, so the town was gone from her, and the night was coming on, and Toby had begun a small dry coughing that frightened her worse than his crying ever had. She turned away from the river, because there was nothing in the river for her now, and up the track that climbed the bench above the ford she saw the one light left on her own side of the water. A single window, low and yellow, in a house set back against the dark hill. She did not remember deciding to climb. She remembered the mud pulling at her broken boot, and the boy's weight doubling with every step, and the light growing until it had edges. A real window, real glass, a door with an iron latch. She got a fist up and knocked. And then she was past knocking and only leaning her shoulder on the wood, and the door came open under her weight. The man who opened it filled the frame. He was near 40, weathered, in his shirt sleeves with the firelight standing behind him, and whatever he had expected on his step at that hour, it was not a soaked stranger folding toward him with a child gone limp in her arms. He did not ask who she was. He did not ask where she had come from, or whose she was, or what the town would say. He looked once at the boy's face, flushed and slack, the eyes half open and seeing nothing, and he reached out and took the weight of the child clean out of her arms as though she had climbed his hill only to hand the boy over. He turned into the light with the child against his chest. "Get in," he said over his shoulder. "Shut the cold out behind you." His name was Elias Crane, though she would not learn it for another hour yet. He laid Toby on the settle by the fire and stripped the wet coat off him with hands that were quick and sure and somehow gentle, and he called for things without ever raising his voice. Dry wool, the kettle, a jar of willow bark from the mantel. He built the fire up until the whole room roared with it, and he set the boy's cold feet near the coals and wrapped the rest of him, and he pushed a cup of something hot into Nora's raw hands before she had managed to say 10 words. They fought the fever the old way, because there was no doctor to be had. The flood had seen to that, had put its brown weight between the bench and the town and every bit of help inside it. Elias steeped the willow bark down bitter and got small mouthfuls of it past the boy's teeth. Nora wrung cloths in cool water and laid them along the child's neck and wrists and lifted them off again when they went warm. The man mixed onion and mustard into a poultice and bound it against the small chest, and the sharp reek of it filled the room, and through all of it Toby burned and muttered, and would not truly wake. It was somewhere past the middle of the night, when the boy's breath had gone at last from a whistle to something slower and deeper, that Elias sat back on his heels and looked at her across the child as if seeing her for the first time. "He's turned the corner, I think," he said. "The next hours will tell." Then, quiet, almost as an afterthought, "What do I call you?" "Nora," she said. Her voice came out cracked from cold and long silence. "The boy's Toby. He's 6. She waited for the next question, the one that always came in every kitchen that had ever taken her in. "Where is his father? What happened to you? What are you running from?" It did not come. The man only nodded, as though a name were the whole of what he had asked for, and got up to lay more wood on the fire. By the 3rd day, the Sable had dropped enough that a man could pole a skiff across on a strung line, and the first crossing brought sacks of meal, and the second brought Mrs. Coyle. She came up the track in her good black coat, with the careful face of a woman performing a kindness she means to be seen performing, and she stopped in the doorway Elias had opened 3 nights before for a stranger. She looked at Nora at the stove and at Toby wrapped and mending on the settle, and her mouth drew into a small, tight line. "Well, Mrs. Coyle said, so the talk is true." She set her basket down as if it cost her something to part with it. "Elias, I'll speak plain, because somebody who wishes you well has got to. Half of Kettle Ford watched that bridge go, and the rest have heard by now that a woman nobody knows walked out of the flood straight up to your door. A drifting woman, with a child, and no husband, and no name a soul can place." She lowered her voice to the pitch women keep for mercy and for knives both. "They are saying she is cursed luck, that the water follows her. You are a widower alone on this hill, with a name that has stayed clean, and I would not see you lose it over a stray." Nora had gone still at the stove with the spoon in her hand. She set it down and spoke to the floorboards more than to anyone in the room. "I'll go. Soon as the boy can travel, I'll be gone, and there'll be no more talk." She had said the same in 100 kitchens, and it had always been the price of a night's warmth, and now she waited to be told yes. Go. Elias did not tell her yes. He had been standing by the window with his coffee, and he set the cup down on the sill with a small click, and he crossed the room and stood beside her. Not in front of her exactly, but at her shoulder, which was worse, which said everything. "Mrs. Coyle," he said, and his voice was as level as a swept floor. "You carried meal up my hill, and I am obliged to you. But hear me on the rest of it. That child was dying on my step 3 nights back, and this woman had carried him up a mud track in the black dark to keep the breath in him, and I opened to them before I knew a single thing about either one. I would do the same tonight, and every night the good Lord sends. A man who would turn a sick child back out into a flood to keep his own name tidy has got no name worth the keeping. You may tell the town I said it. Tell them I said it slow." Mrs. Coyle took up her basket and her mercy and carried them back down the hill, and the skiff bore her over the falling water, and Nora stood in the middle of the swept floor, not knowing what to do with her own 2 hands. No one had ever stood at her shoulder like that. She had been let stay before, out of pity, on the plain condition that she stay small and stay quiet and be grateful and be gone. She had never once been claimed out loud in front of a witness who came to judge. It undid something in her that pity had never reached, and she had to turn to the stove so the man would not catch her face. "You shouldn't have said it," she told him. "Now it's on you as well." "It was always going to be on me," Elias said. "I only chose which way," and he took his hat off the peg and went out to see to the stock, because there was no more to say and both of them knew it. The water did not fall as fast as it had risen. It hung in the low fields a week and more, brown and patient, and it kept the bench a small island of 2 grown people and 1 mending boy. In that week, Noura did what she had always done to earn a floor. She worked. She scrubbed what could be scrubbed and mended what could be mended. And on the 4th morning, hunting scraps of wool to patch the knees of Toby's 1 pair of trousers, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the cold back room. The quilt lay folded on top. It was only half made, a field of little squares in faded calico and Sunday blue, the top all pieced and the batting laid. But the quilting itself barely started, a river of small stitches running out to nothing at the center of the work. The needle was still set in the cloth where a hand had left it, threaded, the loose tail gone stiff with the years. Noura knelt there a long while with the cold coming up out of the chest, and she understood the whole house at once. The rocker that no one sat in, the 2nd cup on the high shelf, the garden gone to weed in its neat dead rows. Somebody had begun this and had not been let finish. She did not ask whether she ought to. That was the one bold thing she did in all of it. She carried the quilt and the frame out to the hearth where the light was good, and she took up the needle a dead woman had set down, and she began, square by square, to finish the work. It took her 3 evenings. Elias watched her at it and said not one word, and she offered him no explaining, and the not explaining became its own quiet understanding between them. On the 3rd evening she stitched the last row shut and bound the raw edge and shook the whole thing out full length in the firelight, a warm and finished thing where a broken one had been, and she laid it over Toby where he slept on the settle. Elias came in from the barn with the night cold still on his coat and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the boy asleep under the finished quilt, and Noura watched the man's face come apart very slowly and very quietly, like ground giving when the frost at last lets go of it. He crossed the room and went down on 1 knee beside the settle and laid his hand flat on the quilt over the sleeping child, and for a moment he could not speak at all. "Margaret pieced this the winter she was carrying," he said finally, low. "We lost them both before the spring came. I could never make myself burn it, and I could never once make myself finish it. 4 years it has laid in that chest." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet and unashamed of it. "And you have gone and put it over a living child." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't take her place." You finished her sentence. After that the days changed, though nobody in the house named the change. Toby, mending fast as small children do, took to trailing Elias out to the barn and back, a little shadow in a too big coat, and Elias slowed his long steps to the boys without ever seeming to. He taught him to gentle the mare, and to fork hay down clean, and to read tomorrow's weather off the color of the western sky. At night the 3 of them sat inside the steady sound of the water, and the not yet spoken thing between the 2 grown people banked itself down low and warm, like a good fire holding its heat through until morning, giving without a single flame you could point to and name. The sable went down at last, sullen and slow, and left the low fields stinking of silt, and the bridge only a memory of bare stone piers standing in the current. Men set to stringing a rope ferry where the span had been, and on the first Sunday a body could cross dry-shod, Elias took Noura and Toby over to Kettle Ford, because he would not sneak them in, and he would not hide them. The church was full, and it went quiet when the 3 of them came through the door. They had not found a seat before Deacon Pruitt rose at the front, a tall, dry man who wore his righteousness like a good Sunday coat, and he did not wait on the hymn. "Elias Crane," the deacon said, and his voice carried clean to the back wall. "This town has held its tongue 3 weeks out of respect for your grief. But a Christian place cannot look away from what all its eyes can see. You have kept an unwed woman and her child under your roof, alone, since the night of the flood. A woman not one of us knows. There are little ones in these pews." He turned his open palms to the room. "I will ask you, before your neighbors and before God, to explain yourself, or else to send her on her way." Elias stood up slowly and set his hat on the bench behind him. He was not a man used to speaking out in a full room, and it plainly cost him, and he did it anyway. "Deacon, you want an explaining, so here it is, and the town may have every word of it." He spoke without heat, plain as a man reading out a true bill. "The night your bridge went into the river, this woman came up my track in the dark, carrying a boy that was 3/4 into the grave with fever. There was no doctor to send for, because the flood had already cut the road. She and I sat over that child till dawn and pulled him back into this world between the two of us. Then the water penned us on one hill a fortnight, and in that fortnight she scrubbed my floors, and she finished my Margaret's quilt, and she put the living breath back into a house that has stood a tomb for 4 years." He looked around the pews, one face at a time. "You want to know what she is. She is the whole reason a 6-year-old boy is drawing breath in this room today. Call that a curse if you have got the gall for it." There was a silence, and into it, to the surprise of everyone and herself the most of all, Nora stood. She had never spoken a word in that town in her life. Her voice shook at the start, and then it steadied, because she had carried a dead man's debts and a live boy's hunger across 3 territories. And she had simply run out of room in herself to be ashamed. "I have been called cursed luck before this," she said. "In other towns, by better-dressed people than are here. I buried my husband a year ago, and I have walked ever since, and maybe walking looks like a curse to folks who have never once had to do it." She put her hand on Toby's shoulder. "But I did not ask this man for his roof. I meant to beg yours, the church's, that floor right there, and the river took your bridge before I could reach it. He opened to me before he ever knew my name, and he never once asked me to be less than I am in order to keep his door open." She lifted her chin. "You may shame him if you please. You will not shame me back into that water. I am through with walking." It was a widow in the 3rd pew who broke it, old Mrs. Tandy, who had buried 2 husbands of her own and did not frighten easily. She stood up in her black and said, clear as a struck bell, "Well, I for one am glad somebody in this town still remembers how a door is opened." She came up the aisle and took Nora's cold hand in both of hers, and after that it was a rout. One after another the pews emptied toward the front, and Deacon Pruitt found himself preaching judgment at the backs of a congregation that had risen and walked straight past him, and Mrs. Coyle discovered she had urgent business with the buttons of her gloves. The deacon sat down a good deal smaller than he had stood up, and the hymn, when it finally came, was louder than any soul there remembered it being in years. The new bridge went up through the summer, raw yellow timber on the old stone piers, and the day the last plank was spiked down the road, ran open again, clear to the territory line, open for anyone who cared to walk it. Elias came in that evening and set a small poke of coin on the table in front of Nora. Honest wages, he said, for a summer of work, counted out fair to the last copper, enough to carry her and the boy anywhere a stage would go. "You are not penned here now," he said. "Bridge is up. Road's dry. You can go find your own people, or go find better than this hill, and no one will breathe a word against you, and I will drive you down to the stage myself if that is your want." He turned his hat around in both his hands, a big man gone suddenly clumsy. "I wanted you free to leave before ever I asked you the other thing, so the answer would be a true one, and not a trapped one." Nora looked at the coin, and at the man, and at Toby asleep in the next room under a dead woman's finished quilt, and she left the money lying exactly where it was. "Ask it then," she said. "Stay," Elias said. Not because the flood set you down here, not because the boy needs a roof over him, for he has got one either way. Whatever you answer, and I will see to it. Stay, because I am the one asking. Marry me. Let this be your house by right, and not by rescue. Yes, she said, by right. And she put her cold hand into his over the untouched coin, and that was the whole of the courting, and neither of the two of them ever needed one bit more of it than that. They were married in the church at Kettle Ford before the leaves turned, by a visiting parson, for Deacon Pruitt had found himself a call in a drier county by then, and old Mrs. Tandy stood up for the bride. Toby carried the ring on a bit of blue ribbon and dropped it once, and the whole church laughed, and it was the kind of wedding a town tells itself about for a generation. The year the drifter woman married the widower up on the bench above the ford. Toby grew up tall on that place. He learned the mare, and the weather, and the river that had so nearly kept him, and he called Elias Pa by the second winter, without either of them ever making a ceremony of it. There were 2 more children after him, a girl and then another boy, and every last one of the 4 learned in turn to sleep under the same quilt. Margaret's calico and Sunday blue, finished by a stranger's hand in a flood year, handed down bed to bed until the little squares wore soft as mothwing and had to be backed with new cloth to hold them together. And that was the story of Nora and Elias Crane, who met at the worst hour either of them had ever known, on the night the river took the bridge and handed back a family in its place. He opened his door before he had learned her name, and he never once shut it against her after, and that, in the end, was the whole of the thing she had been walking all those long miles to find. Would you have opened your door to a stranger come up out of that flood, as Elias Crane did, or would you have kept the latch thrown and told yourself it was only good sense? If this one warmed you tonight, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. I hope it found you well. I'll see you in the next one.